A major court ruling could decide how future elections turn out. Now, this has nothing to do with specific candidates or even Donald Trump. It's all about gerrymandering. We'll have the foremost expert on this in our studio to explain. Then students ramping up protests and walkouts as they demand action on gun control, even as an amazing sit-down with the president took place this afternoon about some new ways forward. But the question is, will anything get done this time around? Also, our panel of attorneys here to look at some of the top legal stories, including the Percoco corruption trial. Now they're talking about The Sopranos and Ziti. I can't make this stuff up. Evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you for joining us this Wednesday evening. In a second, I'm going to introduce our first topic, but I will tell you on the subject of guns, I can't tell how many years I've talked about it on this program. Sadly, one tragedy after another. It's almost been numbed. But what we have seen with the movement really led by the youth in this country after the tragedy in Florida cannot be denied. We'll have in a little bit for you some of what was a really powerful meeting at the White House today, and another important one that's going to happen later on this evening in Florida. And also I'm going to ask my panel of attorneys, where can the law get involved? That all coming up. But we begin tonight with an issue that could have a huge impact in the midterm elections and beyond. And I should tell you, the midterms are now less than 9 months away. Democrats, they're trying to retake control of the House as well as the Senate. And gerrymandering as it relates to the House of Representatives could become pivotal. Now, gerrymandering is defined as manipulating district boundaries to establish a political advantage for a particular party. And it happens very frequently. But a recent ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court could be the beginning of a change to that. The state now has to redraw its congressional districts. That's overturning GOP gerrymandering that impacted the past 3 elections. Some analysts say this could turn 2 or 3 seats from red to blue. And as we speak, we see some districts that look like this. Now, there's no rhyme or reason for it except political advantage, pure and simple. And the High Court in Pennsylvania said that is why Republicans in Pennsylvania did just that. Well, the new map will look more like this, which obviously makes a lot more sense. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court, they're taking up a challenge to Wisconsin's districts, which were gerrymandered by Republicans, that one could have a very wide impact. A few days ago, before the Pennsylvania decision came down, I spoke with Yale Law School Dean Heather Gerken. She, an election law expert. You helped write an amicus brief here for the case that we're going to talk about this before the Supreme Court. Talk about gerrymandering, because while it's not new, it seems in recent years it's been put on steroids. Talk about it as it impacts voting rights.
So gerrymandering is an attempt by one party to prevent the other party from gaining power. And it has a profound effect on voting rights, because what it means is that even when you have enough voters to control 50% of the state, you might only get 1/3 of the seats because another party is keeping itself in power. It basically means it's wasting the votes of the people who are trying to seek change. And it is on steroids these days, Richard. It's because technology has become so precise, because map-making technology and data are so much better than they used to be, you can create a gerrymander that is much more powerful than it used to be.
And I'm going to talk about real examples in both Pennsylvania and North Carolina in a minute, but there is more than an equity standpoint. There's a real question as to First and 14th Amendment rights if they're being violated with this, right?
That's exactly right, because what it is doing is ensuring that your votes are not meaningful if you are from the other side of the political spectrum. So in many ways, you're discriminating against the voter based purely on their partisan affiliation, because you don't want them to vote against you. It's a terrible thing that happens, and it's a real injury in the Constitution.
We're showing some pictures of these contorted districts here that you almost have to, I don't know your level of imagination to come up with, but and both parties have done this. This is not a single partisan thing. But again, in recent years, it has gotten extreme, hasn't it?
It has gotten extreme, partially because the gerrymanders are so much more durable than they used to be.
Explain what you mean by that.
In the old days, it used to be based a lot on guesswork. You didn't have particularly good maps. You didn't have particularly good districting technology. You didn't have a really good sense of who would vote. But 2 things have changed. So 1, the tech is better. But 2, voters are much less likely to vote for the other party than they used to be. So you can, with enormous control, put Democrats or Republicans, whoever's on the other side, into districts that will ensure that their votes are just wasted, and that no matter how many of them turn out, up to a very large margin, you will stay in power even if you don't actually enjoy the support of the people.
That's interesting. The tribalization here now almost adds to the specificity when you design these things.
Exactly.
Right?
It's almost precise these days, and so that makes it even easier to ensure you stay in power.
So we gave a little bit of the background about what's going on, and it's not relegated to 2 states, obviously, but what we're seeing in both Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Talk about those 2 examples, because it's playing out in real time right now, and it's crazy what's going on in Pennsylvania, in both states.
It's playing out in real time, and it's actually shocking the lengths to which the state legislatures are willing to go to keep themselves in power. So in Pennsylvania, for example, their court ruled against them. They said it's unconstitutional under state law, and now they're actually trying to impeach the justices that ruled against them on grounds that are foolish.
Yeah, and I want the audience to get their arms around that. So usually we think, okay, disagreement goes to the courts, highest court in the state. State decides, in this case, no, these maps are crazy, go back, come back and give us a new one. They're actually trying to impeach the judges because they didn't like the ruling. That's beyond even gerrymandering. That's frightening in terms of checks and balances.
It really does threaten the rule of law. I mean, when judges do their job, and they do it in good faith, usually it used to be state legislatures would stand down. But now they're doing everything they can to keep their hold on power because they are so frightened about what the next election holds for them.
Now, it's gotten to this point, and I think fairly people can say, well, where's the court been? They've been looking to legislatures to fix this. Clearly, that's not the case. Is it to the point that we can say it's inarguable that we can leave this to legislatures to fix this because largely they're the problem themselves? Don't the courts have to finally settle this once and for all?
Yes, I mean, this is a little bit like the Star Wars theme, Obi-Wan Kenobi, your only hope. Yeah. The state legislatures are not going to solve this problem. They are the foxes, and they're guarding the hen house. There's no chance at all that they're going to overcome their self-interest and do the right thing. So if the courts don't step in, particularly if the Supreme Court doesn't step in, we are going to enter 2020 with another round of egregious gerrymanders and more people being deprived of an opportunity to cast their vote and make change when they have the votes to do it.
Well, that all brings us to the Supreme Court and Gill versus Whitford, and in the case I mentioned, of which you wrote a brief as well for. Talk about the stakes here. Now, this deals with the Wisconsin case, but obviously the applications coast to coast, and also the timeline. I mean, 2020, I mean, you've got the census, everything else. Talk about the case itself, the stakes, and also how important in a short period of time this could have real-time impact.
So the case is a partisan gerrymander out of Wisconsin, a Republican partisan gerrymander. It's the usual story, right? They have about 50% of the vote. They control 2/3 of the seats. They've protected themselves against losses. And for the first time in a very long time, a court said, no, actually, this violates the Constitution. So that, of course, is something that the Supreme Court is going to review, because for years the Supreme Court has sat on the sidelines in these cases. It's never been willing to take the plunge and to declare there to be a constitutional violation. So the 2 questions that are up in front of the court are, 1, is the court going to do anything? And 2, if the court does something, what kind of standard is it going to adopt so that we know how redistricting will go in 2020?
And explain what judicial manageability is and why in this particular case that's so important.
Sure. Judicial manageability is a long word for an easy idea. Judges are nervous when they enter into the partisan fray. They want to be sure they know what they're doing. They want to be sure they're acting in a lawful manner. They want a standard that is manageable in the sense of easy enough to apply, that you don't worry about a judge's own partisan biases infecting the decision. So it's a guard in some ways. If it's an easy standard to apply, it's an easy standard for judges to put in place. And so that's what the court is looking for, and they've been waiting a long time to find one. And the question is whether the parties have put just such a standard in front of the court this time.
So I'll ask you to play always the risky parlor game to try and take a guess here. And to that end, we're hearing around June is probably when we'll get the decision from the Supreme Court, and as always, it seems that Justice Kennedy is going to be the swing vote.
Yes, I think it's fair to characterize most of the briefs as love letters to Justice Kennedy. The odds are he's going to be the swing vote. The odds are it'll be a case in June because it'll be controversial. And the real question is whether Justice Kennedy is going to think about his legacy and decide that one of his legacies is going to be changing the way partisan politics works going forward.
Is there any tea leaves to read here? The choice that they A, took the case now, and B, what he has said in the past on this?
You know, the tea leaves actually mostly come from what they have done subsequently. So very interestingly, the court also took another case out of Maryland. And it's interesting for a couple of reasons. So one, that's a Democratic gerrymander, which would allow the court to act in a more sort of obviously nonpartisan fashion because it would be ruling for both sides. Two, it's a different theory of the case, so it lets the court really think about the full panoply of arguments in front of it. And three, typically, if they weren't going to act, you would think that they would probably have left that case behind.
Right.
So everyone is beginning to think there's a good chance of action from the Supreme Court, and the oral argument suggested that Justice Kennedy is at least tempted to go down this road.
And in terms of the significance of this ruling and the timeline here, if the ruling comes down in June, how would that impact, for example, the midterms this year? Would it be more 2020?
It won't impact the midterms this year because it's just too late for them to do anything, but boy, will it matter for 2020. Because the one thing about state legislators is that they don't want to create a plan that is going to get torn up in court. They rather keep control of it. So even if there's just a standard in place, it will dramatically affect what every state legislature does post-2020.
And finally, just to bring it full circle, if they needed an example as to how egregious this can get, I'm going to come back to Pennsylvania. Give some of the math here in terms of what size of the population actually recognizes with, let's say, the Democratic Party versus their representation in the state. It was so out of whack.
It is so out of whack. Those numbers are always astonishing, especially for a state that's 50-50. So you think a state that's 50-50 ought to have power divided evenly, but it's not even close. And that's why those legislators are so worried, because if they do redistrict in a way that is fair, that gives both sides an equal shot at getting their party in power, then there's going to be some changes happening.
And Dean, thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard.
And coming up next, we switch gears. President Trump meeting with high school kids, families, teachers, and others, all who want answers about gun control and all want solutions on how to keep schools and kids safe. That as protests and walkouts take place from coast to coast. Will this latest tragedy finally lead to some real change?